to the Drive.
Back to the Drive on 93.7 The Ticket. Jake Bogus and Nick Barr.
You look like if I touched you, you'd be sticky, and frankly, you smell bad.
To the Drive.
Throwback Thursday, Sam McEwen, Omaha World Herald, sitting across from me. Always good to have him in the studio. If you want to hear more of Sam, he's usually here on Wednesdays at noon to talk with John and Tom, Gaskins and Stevens show. Brian Munson, Big Red Report and FoxSports.com is our guest now. He joins us weekly. Brian, I want to start with this before we get into some recruiting questions. I know Sam's got some for you. Today, 17-year anniversary. Brooke Behringer dying in the plane crash. I was young when that happened, man. Fill me in and maybe give people your perspective of what you'll remember about Brooke Behringer.
Oh, wow. I was still in college, so I was back in Kearney, and I was actually, oddly enough, I was hanging out at the Big Apple. I mean, you'll probably know the Big Apple from living out in that part of the state. And I think that somebody ran in and basically said that they had heard that Brooke had died, and we all just kind of blew it off as a rumor, because I think up to that point, and Sam might have some great insight on this one too, I think that the idea of Nebraska turning out a quarterback that actually to play the quarterback position in the NFL, I think was kind of unheard of. So there was this trailblazing, type of path that Behringer was kind of doing for Nebraska and Nebraskans. And I think everybody was really excited to see how well he could go on and do it at the next level. Obviously, highly competitive. I think back to his junior year playing in the Wyoming game, collapsing a lung, and competing and battling through that injury. And, it's one of those stories that you really wished you understood how it played out in the end. And hopefully take some peace with it to say hopefully he's in a much better place.
Brian Munson, Big Red Report and FoxSports.com is our guest here on the Drive 93.7 The Ticket.
Hey, Brian, when I know this week was we're going to switch to recruiting. I know that this was the beginning of the evaluation week for Nebraska, so they're going to have about a month and a half here where they can work. Where are some of the places that they've gone physically? I mean, you can also talk about the prospects maybe they visited, but where are some of the places that they've gone so far?
Man, they have been all over the place. And I think it's one of the things that's unique to Nebraskans and unique to the Cornhuskers is that they have to recruit at such a national scale that they have to fan out as broadly as what they have to do. I know that Coach Garrison started out in Missouri, and he was talking to Jimmy Swain at Lee's Summit. Then he went across the road to West High School and checked out Monte Harrison and Kevin Pendleton. I mean, but that's just like kind of the tip of the iceberg, obviously. I mean, because he was over checking out Goolsby last night in Derby, Kansas. And I know that these coaches have been anywhere from in the backyard, down the road checking out Harrison Phillips in Omaha, to being in California or being in Illinois or being in Wisconsin, being in Texas. They've really been hitting the ground running and covering as much ground and real estate as what they possibly can. And what I like about it, what I like about so far with their effort is it's really kind of started out. At least there's been an emphasis in that 500-mile radius and making sure that those players, like Peyton Newell down in Kansas,
right,
knew that Nebraska was there to come in and check him out when he was competing in a track meet. And then Monte Harrison got a chance to host the Nebraska coaches while he's playing in a baseball game. And I talked to Billy Hirschfeld last night from Wisconsin. Nebraska's the first team to come by and see him, and it's already Wednesday. So it's driving home an importance by Nebraska, that recruit is to that class and potentially to Nebraska. So it's really driving home the right message I think Nebraska needs to be showing this season.
He's on Twitter at Big Red Brian. You can follow him there, and you can check out his stuff online, BigRedReport.com. I'm gonna try and make an analogy, Brian. You tell me if it's true or false. Especially with college basketball, people discuss the AAU circuit and how that has hurt the skill level of college basketball players. Yeah, they're still competitive. Yeah, and they can, dunk it, make jump shots, but they lack the two-hand chest pass, your basic dribbling skills, a lot of them. And basketball is a skill game. As far as football is concerned at the college level, 7-on-7 camps, these all-star games, the skill camps they go to, is that a good thing for college football, or do you think it hinders some players?
I think it's neither here nor there personally. I think when it comes down to the skill, I guess what I would kind of go back and think about the 7-on-7 tournaments that I've shown up for and seen it. It does give those players a great chance to go out there and compete all year long, and I think that number one is a plus. I think you get those players out there and they don't have these segments in their year when it comes to development, and they have to go out there and do it on their own, but they've actually got this other activity or another season they basically build around, training and getting ready for the fall. Because a lot of times those teams, that aren't necessarily running the all-star teams, but you got teams down here that are doing 7-on-7 programs, as a high school team, and they're actually having to go out there and they're actually then putting in the playbook, or not necessarily putting in the playbook, but they're running the playbook. I think that's a great ability or a great chance for those guys to go out there and really build team chemistry. And I think that there's a lot of I don't think you can go out there and necessarily fake, having good fundamentals in 7-on-7. I think actually that will expose it a little bit. I think there's some guys out there that can cut some corners and do some things, because of a skill level. But I think if you take the pads off of guys that don't necessarily run as well, when you put the pads on them, and then you also shorten the field and you shorten the distance between, that these guys have a chance to run and get space. I think that the chances that those guys can go out there and just outshine somebody and outplay somebody on every single play, I think those chances go down dramatically.
I want to ask you kind of an NFL drafts / recruiting question. In the 2008 and 2009 classes, Nebraska signed about 50 guys, 48, 50, somewhere in there. Out of that group of people, Alfonso Dennard has been drafted. The guys that are projected to be drafted this year are Rex Burkhead, potentially Brett Maher, and Damian Stafford, who was a 2011 recruit.
Right.
And then DeJon Gomes was drafted. So Gomes was a junior college guy. Dennard was a junior college, or was a high school guy. And then you've got Burkhead and Maher. So 4 guys out of that 50, and Maher wasn't even one of that group. He was a walk-on. Right. Is that reflective of how poor of a job Nebraska did recruiting back then? How poor they developed? The conference change? What is that indicative of that only really 3 of the 48 signees that Nebraska had has either been drafted or is projected to be drafted?
Wow. I haven't really thought about it in terms of that before. I think that you also look at some guys that have gone through some injuries that's taken them out of the circumstances, or at least the potential to be drafted. That's going to drive that number down a little bit. But I think you're hitting on some good points. I think the conference change plays into it to some extent. I think you geared one way to play in the Big 12. Now you're looking at doing some things a little bit differently when it comes to positions than others. And then I think there's just some guys that had to wait their turn to play until it was so late. And I just don't know if they really got into the flow or really got into the mix and really knew what to do when they hit the ground. And they didn't hit it running. And
right.
They kind of stumbled all over themselves a little bit. And there was a lot of on-the-job training, and I think that if they would have had a little bit more ability to get on the field earlier in their career, like a guy like P.J. Smith comes to mind. I just never felt like he went out there and just was very instinctual. I think athletically you could look at the guy and you could see a player. And you could see a guy that could go out there and run and a guy that could go out there and do a lot of different things. But I just never really felt like that he's truly found a home back there in the secondary. And I just think that he could have been brought along a little bit at a quicker rate anyway, to get back on the field so he learned a few more things earlier on, as opposed to being just thrown out there and then have to hit the ground running. So, but I think it's a combination of everything that you've brought up. Obviously, I guess I'd like to hear what your take was on that too.
Well, actually, I think PJ is a really good example of a guy. He did not have a good pro day up here either. I've always felt like PJ was a guy that kind of overthought it a little bit and locked up a little. I think you make a good point about how he had a chance when he was a sophomore, and then he was pulled off the field after about 5 games, and then he didn't really see the field again until early in 2011. So that's a good point. And then there were some other guys that, I mean, Baker Steinkuhl, if he'd stayed healthy, was probably going to be drafted this year, and he may still. I don't know, but I think that some of the players that they went after were guys early in that 2008 class were guys that Bo didn't really know a lot about, and he took them either on the recommendation of Sean Watson. I don't know who he took it on the recommendation of, but they signed this giant class literally a month after he gets there, and I don't know how he could have known who a lot of these guys were. And a lot of coaches, a lot of college coaches, will wait until their second class to really go after it. Urban Meyer was an exception. He went after it in both classes, but then again, he's Urban Meyer, so he knows what he wants. But a lot of coaches, like Tennessee's putting together this huge class for next year. It's going to be about 28, 29 guys. They're going to be a top 10 class. And Bo didn't do that. He went with the big class right away to resolve depth numbers. And then his 2009 class, I think, is going to be seen as a relative success because of Taylor Martinez and Rex Burkhead, but as a whole class, he didn't get a lot of players out of it. And so I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, I completely agree with all of that. I thought another guy that kind of emerged and then faded was Courtney Osborne. Osborne was part of that first class, too, from down here in Garland, and really liked what he did at the high school level. Went out and watched him a number of times because he played for Mickey Moss down here, and really liked what he and his brother did, physical guys. But I just don't think Steven was ever going to be that true wide receiver guy. I really felt like he'd be more of a special teams standout guy who could double as kind of a blocker, that kind of came in there and did some things a little bit differently when they needed to maybe, set up a person for like end around with a big block coming back. And I thought Courtney was a guy that was emerging as a safety and, had a kind of a disastrous game at A&M, even though I wouldn't agree with that, the late roughing the penalty call, roughing the passer call that he had down there. But I felt like he was a guy that was really emerging from that class, and all of a sudden he was nowhere to be found, just kind of like when PJ shows up and is gone. So, yeah, I think a lot of those guys, there's some inconsistencies also in that secondary, particularly with all the coaching changes that took place. You got to take into consideration Eckler recruiting some guys in that 08-09 class, and then being gone after that, too. So there's some coaching inconsistencies there as well.
Now, the 2011 class had a lot of talent in it, but, of course, about 5 of those guys are gone, and Bubba never really showed up. I mean, he was there for about a month. But that class was interesting in that it had a lot of big names in it, 4-star guys, but a lot of those guys are already gone. So I think they finally started to turn a corner in 2012, and then I thought the 2013 class was pretty good. And I think it's going to end up being a class that they're fairly proud of 2-3 years from now.
I love the 2013 class top to bottom, and I think that they've got the true talent that can go out there and emerge and play right away. I think they got the guys that are overlooked a little bit that potentially could play right away. I like Malik Collins. I like the opportunity that's there for the defensive tackle position, and I also think there's some guys like Suttles that can come in there and you give them a year or two to develop. And people are going to wonder how many people weren't on him. So I obviously think that 2013 is kind of the crown jewel so far of Bo Pelini's tenure there in Nebraska when it comes to recruiting.
Brian Munson, Big Red Report, FoxSports.com. Excuse my ignorance. This is just another generic recruiting question, but it's something we like to debate about in the hallways here at the Ticket. Tom Stevens will walk through the hall, and when Nebraska football gets a football recruit or a basketball recruit, before he even tells you how many stars they have, he will immediately say, hey, well, he was offered by Pittsburgh, so you know he's good. Or he was offered by USC, so you know he's good. Do you tend to focus more on the individual player, his stars, what he's rated, or is it maybe a safer bet to also look at who is offering that player too?
For me, I actually, this is sad, I actually turn on the video and go out there and watch him and try to imagine him, wearing a red and white uniform with an N on his helmet and figure out how he kind of fits in before I do any of that other stuff. I think that there are some teams that watch closely, that benchmark other teams and this is kind of sad because they kind of let other teams do their evaluation for them, but they benchmark other teams to kind of get an idea of who's being offered by what team, and then really without any evaluation at all, they'll go ahead and kind of just offer based on the grounds that somebody else had offered them. I saw that a lot because I thought Dennis Wagner had a tremendous eye for talent when he was an offensive line coach there at Nebraska, and it always seemed that when Nebraska offered guys, that they were kind of being that they were kind of that benchmark team, and it would kind of create this snowball effect to where a lot of teams would then jump in behind Nebraska and offer just as a result. And it seems kind of sad, but I'm kind of a combination. I do look at the offers. It's something that I consider. But then you also have some of the other things to consider about geographical. Where's that person located? You know, like we talked about before with Banderas. Banderas is going to have a ton more offers if he's in, you know, Dallas, or if he's in Houston, or if he's in some other major metropolitan area. So you got to kind of take that into consideration. But that's where I think you put the film on, and you just can't hide what Nebraska's looking at when it comes to offer or when a guy goes ahead and commits someplace.
Yeah, but on that note, Brian, I mean, that's I'm not calling out recruiting guys, but I hear a lot of recruiting guys say that, so I believe it. But then I just think to myself, I mean, these college football coaches can give film on anybody in high school. They can go to any recruiting website they want. If you take it like a Nate Gary in South Dakota, or you mentioned Josh Banderas would have more offers if he were in the Dallas area. Do we know that's true? I mean, do you believe like if Banderas was in Dallas, he would have just received tons more offers and more schools would have been looking at him?
I absolutely believe that. I think Nebraska. I think Nebraska's incredibly fortunate to have a guy like that growing up in their backyard. And I'm not saying that, you know, if Josh Banderas isn't who he is and his dad wasn't a former Nebraska Cornhusker, he doesn't eventually end up in Nebraska anyway if he was in Dallas or he was in Houston. But what I am saying is that it was a lot less of a situation where you had to go out there and compete for the guy because he was growing up, you know, in your backyard. I honestly believe that Josh Banderas, and it doesn't go, you know, that's a guy right there, U.S. Army All-American, you know, a 4-star guy. I think he's a guy that gets thrown around a lot more in you know, the name being thrown around in comparison to other guys that are down here in the area. I think that's one of the things that comes along with just being geographically isolated, like he kind of was being up there in Lincoln. I think you can get thrown into some more comparative situations when, you know, when a guy goes on the field to face another guy down here in Dallas on a Friday night. And I think he's the kind of guy that when he goes out to an NFTC combine, can go ahead and get compared, you know, to a guy that's out there that's across town that he ain't going to see, but he's going to get a chance to compete against, you know, in these one-on-one drills. So I think it's definitely something out there to where Banderas would have been a lot more highly recruited had he lived in another area.
Brian Munson, Big Red Report. He usually joins us on Thursdays here on The Drive. Brian, good stuff as always, man. We'll catch up soon. Thanks, Brian.
Great talking to you guys. We'll see you.
You bet. Brian Munson, Big Red Report.